The Antec Flux Pro is Antec's newest case using the Flux platform, and I don't know what that means. According to Antec, quote, the definition of flux is flow luxury. However, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, flux is, quote, a flowing of fluid from the body, such as dysentery, or, okay, that doesn't sound as good on the box. We'll just go with Louis Rossman's version of flux.
You can never use too much flux.
So Antec's been making a bit of a return recently. We recently looked at their C8 ARGB, which we liked as a case, and this one we like overall as well. So the flux lineup has wood accents on the front of the case, and then internally, they, depending on which one you go with, have either 5 fans or 6. So this is what they call the Flux Pro. This is what we're reviewing today. This one comes with 6 included fans. 2 of them are mounted to the top of the power supply shroud as reverse blade fans, so they bring air up and in. That's going to be through the perforated panel here, which pops off and reveals that, for the most part, it's got pretty close access to outside air to bring it up and straight into the GPU. The power supply can also be shifted, so that's kind of different. We'll talk about that today. And then up front, there is this simple digital display, which is a little gimmicky, but we've seen on cases in the past. Some people like it. It's basically a temperature readout. So if you like that type of thing, it has it. But either way, we are focused, as always, on the thermals, the acoustics, and sort of the objective side of the case. We're going to go through that in addition to the build quality notes, kill management, everything else with the Flux Pro. And then for pricing on this one, it is, see, this is the cool thing about glass panels. I can still read my script. $180 or $185 for the white model. I don't know how they made see-through materials. Before that, this video is brought to you by Arctic and the Liquid Freezer 3, which we've tested using our standard methodology and found to be one of the most noise-efficient CPU coolers on our charts. The Liquid Freezer 3 includes rise and offset mounting to improve AMD performance and uses a thicker radiator to further lower the temperatures. Arctic has priced these competitively for AIOs, and you can learn more at the link in the description below. All right, so right away, the Flux Pro is a relatively large ATX case. The Fractal Torrent is probably some of its closest competition. The Torrent remains, for years now, the best performer for our test benches in an air cooling setup. So this is pretty stiff competition. It's about $180, which is the same price as the Flux Pro. The difference is that the Torrent is sometimes now going on sale. I think I saw an ATX model Torrent, that one, for $140 recently. So that's going to be, we think, the biggest one to pay attention to in the comparisons today. We have other cases on the charts as well. And then the non-pro version of this is a little bit smaller. It's a mid-tower, and that one's priced at $120 to $125. It also loses one of the fans. Now, as for kind of quick walk around of the case first. So first of all, it's a standard, not dual chamber chassis. The front panel, let's just start there, pops off pretty easily. They are using, okay, well, that one wasn't as easy as the other one. Let me just, there you go. See that? So they're using a mixture of snaps and magnets, we'll kind of come back to that, to hold it secure. And then otherwise the wood on these cases, it's just only around the outer edges, so they don't have the fractal sort of bars down the center look that a lot of companies are going with, but they did want to throw it in there. So it's kind of more the approach that Liam Lee's going with some of its cases. For the rest of the walk around though, so there's 3 included 140s in the front. Those are in a tray, and then on the side here, this panel's pretty important because it's perforated, pops up and out like that, very easy to disassemble. This is toolless. It is held in by the glass when it's in there, so it's not going to go anywhere when there's glass in there. The top of the power supply shroud, this is also a pretty important area of detail. So they've got just massive holes underneath the fans when you remove the pop-out cover that's in there. So when that comes out, it's just a big hole. Becomes a super clear access to air for the fans, and they'll pull air in through the sides of that perforated side panel like I talked about. Now, some cases, like the Torrent, like the 207, they'll instead move the power supply up and then push these down, which gets them closer to the floor, gives them even more access to air. Antec's going for kind of a middle ground here. It's a lot better, though, than something like the Corsair 3500, which has a closed-off side on at least one of the sides, and there's no real access to air for it. The other good attention to detail thing on airflow is that Antec perforated this lower third of the other side panel, where this is another detail that we see a lot of manufacturers skip, where they just do a steel panel. And when you're trying to do intake through the top of the power supply shroud, that doesn't make any sense because you just want it to be able to pull from every side possible, especially since it's a little distant from the true bottom of the case. So anyway, that's kind of a quick walk around, and now we can start getting into details. And I'll start with the visuals before we get back into the function. So first of all, Antec's approach to the white coloring on the white skew of the case, we think is pretty good. A lot of the companies will see when they do a white model of case, they kind of stop short. So this one, they went with white for the connector, but also for the cable. And sometimes they'll go for black for at least one of the two. Typically it's the connector. So that was nice to see. All the plastics and rubber pieces like the power supply supports, the drive, vibration dampers, Velcro straps, I/O cables, USB ports, and even the fan and RGB hub are white, while the hardware and written labels are silver. There's a couple downsides, so the white skew is $5 more expensive, but it also makes grime and leftover plastic mold release visible. The color matching isn't always perfect, like on the iShift extension cable, and the silver labels are hard to read at certain angles, but in spite of that, we think it looks good. The small 7-segment display on the side of the power supply shroud can report CPU or GPU temperatures or both via an internal USB header. It kind of feels like a feature from Antec's heyday back in the 2000s, especially with the retro Antec iUnity interface that's required to activate the display. This feature is always bordered on kind of gimmicky, and the extra software only to control it is definitely a downside, but leaving it off renders it relatively unnoticeable on the black model, and some people might like it. One other thing this does is it has an option to rotate the power supply. It's not required, but they've got a basically optional mount that they call iShift to 90-degree power supply mount, and it moves it so that the exhaust can come out this side. The intake on the bottom will be less restricted, so it should position it so that the fan has more open access, unobstructed to the air at the bottom of the case, and then otherwise it moves the modular cables in the sense that it kind of repositions them to maybe be a little easier to manage. But this all plays off of what Corsair was doing with its Shift series of power supplies. Liam Lee's doing that now too. The difference is this isn't a power supply change, it's a change to the case. All it does is rotate it. It's just a fancy way to rotate it. The goal here is that modular connections become easier to access and route. There are some situations where this doesn't really help, like the Corsair 6500 series cases, but using either a side interface power supply or the iShift mount specifically with the Flux platform is a good combination. Moving cables out of the way theoretically allows a better airflow path in some places. The Flux Pro's wide vents were clearly designed to take advantage of this, and we're overall excited about the solution because it reminds us of cases like the Lian Li Lancoil 3, but all in on the shroud top cooling concept rather than including it as an option. Now, there are better solutions for bottom-mounted fans for intake, and one of them isn't out yet, so we'll have to test it and see if it actually works out to be better. But in concept, everything makes sense with the Lancoil 207, which again sinks those fans as much as possible, gets rid of, it's like going backwards 20 years, gets rid of the bottom power supply shroud, and old is new again. But another example of foregoing the power supply shroud would be the Antec C8, which obviously the same company makes. That is probably the least restricted intake we've seen anytime recently. As far as a kind of standard shroud top approach, though, this one is one that we think is well executed. As we discovered hunting for missing rubber power supply supports, the Flux Pro can be disassembled to an impressive degree. Both sides of the shroud are removable, which is helpful when using the iShift mount. The top and front fan mounts are both removable as well, which fully opens up the case. A side effect of all the removable panels is that the toolless glass panel is held in by the toolless metal shroud cover, which caused some initial concern for us. However, the glass panels on our samples are both secure. The front panel is held in place by snaps and magnets, which is overkill in a good way, but Antec clearly didn't want to risk sloppy tolerances with the most visually important area. Radiator compatibility is also excellent on the case, so having 3140s in a spot on a case doesn't guarantee 420mm radiator support in every case. In this one, it actually works out. So the actual fan mount here up front can be shifted several notches. I don't know if it might be easier to see it from this side, but you can see these. Where are they? Is it here? I can't see it. The goal is that you can see it. Hang on. Okay, all right. But you can see these notches which allow it to be repositioned, and actually Patrick, when he was doing the testing, part of our testing process is to mark which fan is where and how the fans are mounted in position so we can replicate it through all the testing, keep it consistent. But point is, you can see where we had it mounted, this can be moved, which would accommodate not only 420 radiators, but also some of the larger and stranger, less common pump-on rad 420s, which these days aren't too prevalent. The top 420 mount is tighter, but the entire tray can be lifted off of the case, and there's a massive 7 centimeters of clearance between the top fan mounts and the top edge of the motherboard. Antec depicts some ridiculous configurations on the product page, like a dual 360 plus 420 setup with one of the 360 rads on top of the power supply shroud and a push-pull. We wouldn't want to encroach on the motherboard that much, but the point stands. You can fit many radiators and many fans into this case, even under the shroud, where there's technically room for another 240mm radiator. It is comically accommodating. All right, cable management is up now. Using the iShift mount means committing to keeping the cable slack behind the motherboard tray. In either case, though, Antec's Velcro straps do enable better cable management. They're pre-installed. We do think that cable management is more visually important on this case than some of the others due to the ventilation on all sides of the shroud. You'll be able to see through it, so color of cables and cleanliness might pop out more. Cable cutouts are standard overall, with the exception of a relatively small CPU power cutout up top. We also liked the tie points on the rear of the case for external cables, which is a feature that we've complimented Fractal for in the past. Using the shift mount makes connections accessible and benefits EPS 12-volt routing, but we wouldn't go as far as agreeing with what Antec said, which is, quote, "Routing has never been easier." Antec actually included this card in the accessory kit, which describes the 4 different ways to install your power supply. And while the instructions are good, we would not agree that it has never been easier. Actually, on that note, we tried to follow the cable routing guide in the manual when connecting our 12-volt high power cable. Obviously, we know how to do this, but we always want to test their instructions too, and the diagram just isn't readable in the 2D format it is. Now, the Flux Pro also comes with a hub for fans, and although we appreciate its presence, we don't use hubs for testing the thermals of a case. We have standards that we have to follow for the testing. Either way, though, we did think it was a little bit strange that the fan hub here only has 5 connections, which is maybe a remnant of the non-Pro model only having 5 fans rather than 6. So unfortunately, you end up with these really cleanly, nicely routed cables for all the fans in the case, except for the back one. And that one you can just plug into your motherboard, which is fine. It just seems like kind of, it was that close to just being a fully complete approach. Anyway, could be a relic of the original Flux platform, but the hub is SATA powered and it acts as a simple splitter for 4-pin PWM fans and 3-pin ARGB signals with 5 outputs each. The Flux Pro does not contain any LEDs, RGB or otherwise, outside of the temperature monitor. Now for drives, there are 2 2.5-inch mounts behind the motherboard tray, 2 2.5 or 3.5-inch mounts towards the front of the case, and a cage under the shroud that can hold one more 2.5 or 3.5-inch drive inside and one on top. The hardware is freely repositionable for this, so we'd recommend just pulling that whole assembly out and relying on the other mounts if you don't need that many drives. The reasons are that it frees up several more fan slots, it removes an airflow obstruction, and the remaining 2 3.5-inch mounting locations have rubber vibration dampers, which the front bottom one does not. Now this case supports so-called E, so-called ATX, which isn't a real standard. We have a whole separate rant video on that. Those would be SSI EEB and SSI CEB. But anyway, it supports eATX. As for what that means in this case, it boards up to 285 millimeters in length. However, larger boards can fit. It's just that they'll extend past the grommet. And ignore the socket protector that we have on this. So anyway, up to 330 millimeters would technically fit, but only by overlapping the cable cutouts, and there's no standoffs beyond the standard ATX footprint. Antec sent us 2 Flux Pros, one's black, one's white. The black one showed up perfectly fine, but the white model had a large bend at the rear of the case. And whenever this happens, we inspect the packaging to try and determine if it was the manufacturer's fault or if it was the carrier's fault. Antec's packaging is at least as good as the industry norm here, so the damage comes down to rough shipping. 4 sticky rubber power supply supports also popped off and rolled into every corner of the case during shipping, so the white case probably experienced some higher temperatures when it was in transit. This one, though, seems more likely to be a manufacturing issue and maybe a problem of the adhesive choice not being sufficient. The Flux Pro's accessory kit also includes a couple things, not a whole lot. There was the card we talked about for power supplies. the manual. They have a more standard power supply frame. If you didn't use the iShift mount, there's this thing, which is basically an FSC certificate for the sourcing of the wood, and then also some optional covers for the top of the power supply shroud in the event you don't use fans there to get rid of them or whatever. And then finally, and actually we did like this, there's just the screw container with everything pre-sorted for the build once it comes in for assembly. Detail here is good as well. So there were exactly 8 screws for the 2 possible 3.5-inch drives, exactly 4 screws to attach the 2 additional shroud covers. There isn't a set of spare dust caps for the top I/O like there was with the Antec C8, but that's fine by us. So overall, for build quality, we do like how the case is put together. Patrick and I both have worked a little bit on this case now. He's worked on it a lot. There goes all the covers. So top panel is normally a place I like to look for sort of assembly quality and rigidity of the materials. This one, they ended up using this larger steel that's rolled over itself around the borders. That always helps with keeping stuff, so it's not caving in like the Corsair 6500 we looked at. They're using multiple of the sort of ball joint snaps that we see on a lot of the cases these days, and then plastic is used in a couple locations sparingly, like the front panels. But even there, where they're using plastic for the snaps, they have the magnets to help hold it in place and center it. So a lot of really small detail that we liked on this one. Now, though, it's time to look at what really matters to us, which is the thermals. So for thermal testing for this, the Flux Pro has the 6 included fans. For our baseline, we used that stock configuration with the iShift mount to rotate the power supply 90 degrees, and then we did an additional pass with the power supply in the standard orientation. Theoretically, the iShift mount should be better for airflow. Removing the bottom hard drive mount would improve it even more, but we were consciously avoiding going overboard with the additional test because we like to try and keep this as close to stock out of the box as we can. We aren't seeing as many regular full towers these days, like the Meshify 2XL or the pricier Corsair 7000D Airflow from a few years back. Among cases we've covered recently, though, larger ones include the Fractal North XL, which is the most obvious new comparison. The 2024 redesign of the NZXE H7 is a close match as well, though we haven't had a chance to test it yet. Antec's own C8 ARGB is in a slightly lower price bracket and completely different form factor, but it obviously shares some Antec styling with the Flux Pro, which makes it another direct competitor. And then, of course, the Fractal Torrent, which is just the high airflow sort of king. I mean, at this point, it's goated as a case. So anyway, let's get into the thermal testing. First of all, this is with our new test bench. So we're still populating these results, but they're getting pretty filled in. Noise normalizing all cases to 27 dBA, and with a full system torture workload, the CPU averaged 41 degrees Celsius above ambient across all cores and 45 over ambient for the P cores. This makes the Flux Pro the new chart leader when noise normalized. It's a great start for the case, and it shows that its stock fans are effective. It's better than the North XL's best result of 46 degrees P-core, but still fairly close, which makes sense given the similar focus on strong front-to-back airflow in both cases. The Torrent sits between the two. Bottom-to-top airflow doesn't benefit the CPU cooler in our setup as much, as demonstrated by the much warmer 54 degree P-core averages achieved by the Antec C8 in the same test. Looking at the rest of the chart, the Flux Pro scored the best result we've seen since our most recent case refresh. This is an incredibly strong position for Antec, though the Torrent gets credit for hanging on as long as it has and being effectively within error. Now on to GPU thermals with the same combined CPU and GPU torture workload, but with case fans at 100% speed. This means that we're letting the systems run at whatever noise level they hit when maxed. CPU and GPU fans remain controlled and at the same speeds as before. The Flux Pro's baseline ran at 38 degrees Celsius above ambient for the average GPU temperature, 50 degrees for the hotspot, and 43 for memory junction. Rotating the power supply won't have much impact unless you have a massive amount of cables obstructing airflow. In our rotated test, the temperatures dropped by 1 degree across the board, but that was by moving it back to the standard orientation. It was at 37 degrees Celsius above ambient on the core, 49 hotspot, 42 memory. There's a few factors at work here. Our setup uses a modular power supply that's only 15 centimeters deep, and the Flux Pro is large enough that there's not a lot of slack cable. So for us, there's really not a lot of cable clutter around the shroud regardless of orientation. We still like the iShift mount, but you should view it more as a cable management tool, not something that's going to massively improve GPU thermals. In this case, it was basically error. There was really no meaningful difference. Compared to other cases, the most impressive thing here is that Antec has now chart topped at 100% fan speed for the GPU thermals, in addition to its prior noise-normalized results for CPU thermals. At almost 40 dBA, it's slightly quieter than the Torrent at 42.3 dBA in our hemianechoic chamber, while also running with an error of it for thermals, or slightly cooler with the standard orientation. The height Y70 is also somewhat competitive with side intake, mostly because it's technically quieter than both of these options, but still close in thermals. And the Antec C8 also fits this, running quieter and slightly warmer. The Fractal North XL is much less efficient in thermals for its noise trade-off, if you want to look at it that way. CPU temperatures were completely unchanged by the PSU orientation, so we'll skip those. Moving back to noise-normalized results at 27 dBA, the GPU averaged 41 degrees Celsius above ambient with 53 hotspot and 47 memory. We haven't always had the best results with shroud top fans. Looking back at our old bench and our prior results from years ago, the LAN-cooled 215, when we added a fan to the shroud, proved to be no better off. That fan was ineffective. The Flux Pro overcomes this by just adding fans until the problem goes away. The North XL with its mesh side panel did well here, but the Flux Pro is better by 3 to 4 degrees. The C8 ARGB is similar to the Flux Pro in that it has bottom fans directly pointed into the GPU, but the Flux Pro beats it as well, with the C8 ARGB averaging about 1 degree higher. In fact, among the limited set of cases we've tested with this current bench, the Torrent is the only one with better GPU thermals. It remains the king in at least this one aspect for a little bit longer. And that the Flux Pro is even up here with the Torrent at all is already great, because the Torrent, when you look back at our old results, which had hundreds of case entries on them, that was at the top of all of those. So the Flux is up here. It would have been up there on the old bench as well. Our standardized fan test was requested by viewers many years ago and was a standalone piece with its own methodology. It has pros and cons we've detailed in the past. One of the downsides is hindering performance of cases that come with more or better fans. Sometimes people request tests where we populate all fan slots. We've done those in the past. Actually, in a lot of cases, they make the performance a little worse, and they pass diminishing returns, but we've explained that in the past. This test uses 3 Noctua fans that are 2 140s in the front and 1 120 in the rear. They're all set to maximum speeds. In the Flux Pro, we set these up in the usual front intake and rear exhaust arrangement. Average CPU temperature was 38 degrees Celsius over ambient and 42 on just the P cores. We haven't discussed CPU thermals with the stock fans at full speed yet, but the results were the same. In terms of CPU performance, this arrangement is basically the same as stock. The standardized fan test is most useful for case-to-case comparison when cases ship with insufficient stock cooling. That does not apply to the Flux Pro or cases we're directly comparing it against, including the North XL and the Torrent. So we're not going to delve into comparisons here because it's basically irrelevant. Now for GPU thermals with standardized fans. Obviously, removing the shroud top intake fans for our standardized fan test didn't help the GPU thermals. The average temperature climbed to 43 degrees above ambient with a hotspot of 56 and memory at 50. If we need any more proof that the shroud intake fans were actually doing something, this is it. Back to our baseline noise-normalized results with the fans that are actually included with the case. VRM thermals averaged at 27 degrees above ambient. The Flux Pro had chart-topping CPU thermal performance, and given the location of the VRM, it's logical that this temperature is chart-topping as well. The mesh-sided North XL came close at 28 degrees, while the C8 ARGB and its focus on bottom intake averaged a significantly warmer 33. SPD hub temperature averaged 22 degrees above ambient, still good, but beaten by some cases like the Torrent and the Kin95 Pro at 21C. Overall, Antec's thermal performance is exceptional. All right, so this one's pretty easy to conclude. The Antec Flux Pro is the new chart leader in most of our charts. In our one chart where it's not the chart leader, it's basically tied with the chart leader. It's close enough. So that's great for Antec. Our old testing methodology had hundreds of entries for variations on cases and cases themselves. I don't know how many actual just cases it was at least 100 though. We have not retested all of those, but it doesn't matter because we have retested the Torrent, and the Torrent was the best in the old methodology and the best in the new methodology. It's consistent across very different types of video card cooler, which is just useful for other reasons, but this beats that. And so Antec's doing well right out the gate here from a performance standpoint. It already has a strong leg up. Now, for the rest, the main downsides are, I guess, the MSRP. It's $180 to $185. There are some strong competitors at that price. Fractal's North XL, though, also carried a $180 MSRP, so launched about the same price. It's a close competitor, and at that price, we'd say the Flux Pro wins in at least the thermal category. The North XL is on sale at the time of writing, though, for as low as $130 for the top performing mesh-sided SKU. So that complicates things. That's a pretty big advantage for the North XL. The recently launched NZXT H7 Flow, not to be confused with the previously launched NZXT H7 Flow or the future to be launched NZXT H7 Flows, has a similar focus, at least currently, on bottom intake GPU cooling for as low as $130 MSRP, but it only comes with 3 fans, which can be fine, just depends how they're configured, and we haven't tested it yet. The 7000D is too expensive to directly compare. The Fractal Torrent remains a direct thermal competitor, and when it's on sale, should definitely remain on short lists. We still like that case a lot. At this point, I'd say it's fair to call it goated. It is an older case now, though, for anyone who cares about that. Cases ultimately are a combination of features, performance, and looks. If you really like the look of something else, like the North XL and its use of wood over how Antec does it, and if you have your heart set on that one, it's still a perfectly good case. Just because it's beaten in thermals doesn't mean it's a bad case suddenly. But the Flux Pro is making a very strong performance showing and argument for itself. Now, sales aside, some of the strongest competition also comes from Antec itself, with its own C8 ARGB at $150 and the smaller non-Pro Flux at $120 to $125. We haven't tested the regular Flux non-Pro. We have been hands-on with it at events. We can assume, though, that its quality is similar because the spec is pretty similar. Reasons to choose the Flux over the C8 are the traditional non-dual chamber layout and the shroud top cooling, if those aspects appeal to you. Going by spec sheet, reasons to choose specifically a Flux Pro are the multiple larger radiator mounting options, including the top of the shroud, generous clearance on all the components, and extra drive support. The iShift mount is cool, but it's really not make or break. It doesn't do as much as it kind of claims. It's basically just a cable management feature. Back connect motherboard support could be make or break for some people, so keep that in mind. The regular Flux supports it, but the Pro does not officially support it. Overall then, this ends up on our short list of recommendations at this point because, I mean, we've always been very open and forward that our biases here are for performance, and as long as the looks kind of hit the it's fine box and it has excellent performance, then that's already enough to land on our list of recommendations. Looks of this are subjective. Like we said, if you like the North XL or something, go for it. It's a fine case. The price by MSRP is the same. The sales, you give it an advantage right now, but we do like this one overall. It is great to see a company like Antec coming back, swinging, and giving some stiff competition to the incumbents in the market, make sure people don't get too lazy. So it's one of the things that I personally really like about case reviews is that because it's not just 2 big players or kind of 3 like you see in GPUs, it seems like everybody really keeps each other in check in terms of both the innovation and the prices. You'd think there wouldn't be a lot of innovation in cases or in coolers, but actually there still is somehow. So it's great to see. Definitely happy to have a good ATX case for performance that's new. So otherwise, there's plenty of others on the charts if you want to check them out. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. We've got more coming up for you. So check back for that. And you can go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to support our testing directly. And we'll see you all next time.